All right, hello everybody. My name's Michael Knox and I'm presenting question 16, 26 and 27 from the 2020 Mathematics Advanced paper. So I was the resolving senior marker on that paper and just like to offer my thoughts and a few teaching tips for you for these styles of questions for the future. So hopefully this will help your teaching and help your students in the future. So here we go. So question 16. So question 16 was a nice polynomial, labelling, sketching, stationary points, points of inflection. So a few things that I'll point out, some positives first of all. Pretty well done by most candidates, this question. So it was worth 4 marks and a lot of students were able to access either 3 or 4 of those marks. The main error that came up, if I just show some of the errors as well, some of the students didn't label. So labelling was a key thing in the question. It was a key description there, but a significant number of students lost a mark there because of the labelling. So they didn't label their stationary points and they didn't label their point of inflection, for example. Very well. They did find stationaries. They then showed us if they were maximums, minimums, and they found a point of inflection. One of the other errors down there with the point of inflection was that a lot of students graphed that as a horizontal point of inflection. So one of my learning outcomes here for you as teachers is to make sure that students label their axes and just make sure they point of inflection. So there were a significant number of students who graphed a horizontal point of inflection there. So just work on that one in class, I think. But overall, that was a very well done question. Most students knew it was a nice smooth curve, a polynomial. They had the turning points, etc. If students did make errors early with either the differentiation or the factoring, then their process of their working out was still there and they were still able to access some good marks in this question. So again, keep encouraging that working out. If students are showing working out, we will always write our marking schemes to help them gain as many marks as possible for that. So question 16, yeah, a very well done question. I think as most teachers would expect on a nice curve like that one. So question 26. So we're into the finance now. Now, part A question with the standard course. So these have these. So the other senior marker and myself, we teamed up with the standard senior markers and we came up with a common marking scheme so that both courses were marked the exact same way. So if you gained a 0, 1 or 2, you got it by doing the exact same things, regardless of which course you were in, standard or advanced. So that was an interesting process and something slightly different this year. And it was on part A and B of question 26, and it was also question 27, which we'll talk about soon. So this one here, we had a finance question where we had $60,000 investing it into an account at 0.5% per month, each month. An $800 withdrawal was made. And we have this little recurrence formula down here. The next slide is the actual question. Use the recurrence relation to find the amount of money in the account after the 3rd withdrawal. So positives and errors. Okay, some positives. Most students did know how to use a recurrence relation, which was good. Probably slightly more in advance than the standard course, and I think that's just due to the algebra. But the first dot point in the errors there were also significant numbers of students who really didn't understand the recurrence relation. So I don't know, if I had to estimate, maybe 80% of students knew what was going on here with the recurrence relation and maybe 20% didn't. And it came down to those subscripts, the n and the n-1. So I would make sure in your lessons that if you're doing anything with recurrence relationships, make sure that you do highlight what those n and n-1 subscripts mean. Some students thought it was just somewhere to substitute some numbers in there. But yeah, just make sure that students are aware of that. Some students here took an algebraic approach because I think we, as teachers, still used to that old course where we used to, set up a geometric series, and some students did that, which was fine, and then they did their substitutions, etc. at the end, which was totally fine as well. Rounding errors, so please make sure students don't round too early in questions. So those that were working things out with calculators, etc., just watch that rounding. Calculators, a little bit of a theme for question 26. So I would put into some of your lessons some specific calculator questions, particularly things with brackets, with powers, with division, with all those square roots, things like that, where they have to do several different processes in that one calculation. There were obvious discrepancies there with students who could do it really well and students who struggled to use a calculator. So encourage rounding at the end. Practice more and just one subscript notation. Part 2, calculate the amount of interest earned in the first 3 months. So again, this was common with the standard course. There was a few positives and a few negatives. Most students did it quite well. Students certainly found that this was a fairly nice question to gain 2 marks on. And most students, obviously, understanding what interest was, most advanced students could pick that up. They knew interest was the extra part. So how much extra did we get, if you like? They understood what that term meant. So again, with finance, I guess it's just that focusing on a few of those main terms. What is interest? What is depreciation? That kind of stuff. Some candidates, though, failed to recognise there was a connection with part A. So they thought this was a whole brand new question and they didn't take their previous answer from part A. They tried to invent a new question. Those students who tried to invent a new question here in part B often went down a simple interest or a compound interest path, which of course is not how you do this question. So yeah, that kind of led to some major problems with us in the advanced course, particularly with compound interest. There was a fair percentage of kids who started this as a compound interest question and just didn't come up with the right answer. So learning outcomes, just ensure students know when to use simple and compound interest versus this recurrence kind of relationship. And again, make sure they can relate part A's and part B's. So when questions, it's set up as A, B, C, there's usually a reason for that. So, the examiner has broken up the processes of 2 marks for A, 2 marks for B, which follows from A. C may then follow from B, etc. So just, always point that out to kids in classes when you're looking at past papers. And part C, calculate the amount of money in the account immediately after the 94th withdrawal. Now, this was an advanced part only, so this was not given to the standard kids. It's not in their course. So this is where we did need to set up a geometric series, which some students did in part A. So some kids did this all set up in part A. They transferred it first immediately after the 94th withdrawal. So there are 94 terms in our series. One of the main errors was 93 terms in a series, or students who had 94 terms, but they used N as 93, which I think is one of my dot points, the third dot point there. So when they substitute into the geometric sum formula, they should have been putting N equals 94. But because of that first term, 93 was common. So again, just practicing that geometric series formula with some simple series summing, and then get onto this financial kind of work. But yeah, that was a common error. Errors in development of that, or the indices, the powers as they went up in that series, and not taking 800 as a common factor when they did the geometric sum. So if you've looked at the solution there, 800 is the common factor sitting outside of that geometric series that we have to sum. Some students used 800 in the geometric series and thought there was a different factor to take out the front there. So again, it's practicing geometric series formulas, the sum of the geometric series, but then transferring those skills to a financial question. Also, for some reason in this part, the interest rate was 0.5% per month. And students may have A and B. For some of students who wanted to then change that here, and you know, they put 0.0005, they divided the 0.5 by 12 and things like that, even though they hadn't done that in part A and B. So again, I think it's just a reminder to students, once they get down to part C in a question, remind them to go back, reread the question, and yeah, think of how they just did part A and B, and not sure why they would then change the interest rate here, but there were students who did that. So learning outcomes, just practice setting up geometric series. So that's that whole first 3 terms, and then working through to the nth term. So that nth term is an important line. Practice using the geometric sum formula. Recognise what is the common factor. So in this case, 800 to take out the front of that geometric series. And the last dot point there with learning outcomes, there were a few bold answers here, which were correct. However, that student has just sat on a calculator 94 times. That wasn't the whole idea. So, okay, so it can be a correct bold answer, but it may not get those 3 out of 3. All right, so we don't really want someone sitting here on some pro. If they had, and there were some students who had some working out and had then said, now I press the calculator. So they might have had the first 4 things set out beautifully with an answer, and then they might have given us an explanation. Now I've pressed the calculator doing the same thing 90 more times, and then showed us the last 2 again. That's better than just using a calculator, all right? But again, that student's wasted a lot of time. So it's how much time do you want to spend using a calculator, pressing it 94 times with a complicated process when you can just do that sum formula. So yeah, again, highlight that geometric series. And how to something with part C. So a 5-mark question. So having marked papers for quite a few years, I think this is the first 5-mark question I've ever had, which was interesting because there's no part A, B, C, D, it's just 5. All right, now, again, if I just go to the next screen for a second, the question wouldn't even fit on one slide here, it goes over the page. So we've all seen this question from last year. There's a lot of reading, okay? The main thing with the learning outcomes here, down here in the black section, this is a 5-mark question. There is a lot of reading. I think as teachers, we need to give our students these longer questions. We need to give them a little bit of time in class to focus. What's important in this question, what isn't, take out a highlighter, underline in red, whatever it is that they're going to use as a bit of a highlighting tool. Because as you read through this question, we've got the number 15, the number 20, we've got a box and whisker plot that goes from 13 through to 27 degrees. They're talking about mean temperature. They're talking about crickets chirping, 684 chirps for 20 data points. There's an equation down here. There's a least squares regression line mentioned. We've got B, the slope of the regression line. We've got X bars, Y bars, 15, 19. There's a lot of stuff happening in this question. So when I first, I think I read this and thought, okay, what is going on here? Next read, started to pick out a few bits and pieces. On the final read, had all the bits and pieces together that I knew I needed for the question. Now, I've had, 20, 30, whatever it is, years experience teaching. These are students that have only had 2 years in the classroom. So I think it's a skill that we as teachers need to start training our students in a longer response question with a lot of information, how to pick out that information. And I don't know that we've kind of done that too well with past advanced papers, because we haven't had a question this lengthy and possibly worth 5 marks on its own. So that would be my main thing, practice this in the classroom. So this would be a good one to give your students this year, pick out the bits and pieces and see if they can put it together, okay? So look, the other thing is once they start writing through here, through this question section, that's not ideal because there are lined spaces where they're meant to put their answers. But we do look at everything. So question 27 starts here where it says question 27. Not ideal if they start putting, mean, modes, medians, ranges, whatever near this box and whisker plot. But one of those things was part of the solution. Here, they've started to write things next to the box and whisker plot. That, for us, is basically saying, well, they have shown us a little bit of working out, and a little bit of that is correct, and a little bit of that's worth a mark. So we will look at the writing here, not necessarily the underlining, but anything written. However, I would encourage students that anything written up here amongst the question, it can very easily be overlooked. It should be in that line section, that section where they're meant to put their answer. So just get them to copy anything down there. So positives. Look, most students did attempt to engage with this question. Again, this was common with the standard course. So we looked at standard papers, we looked at advanced papers. The advanced students did attempt to engage. That may not have necessarily been the case with the standard students. This may have put them off the length of the question. However, that's a positive. So they did attempt to engage. There were some quality responses. So there were students gaining 5 out of 5 here, definitely. Okay, so there was quite a few people that got through the information, picked out the relevance parts and put it together appropriately. So that was very pleasing as well. Obviously, those students who made it into the higher marks, 3, 4, 5, their setting up was logical. It was in an order that made sense. They thought about the question, picked out a few key facts, written down 2 or 3 key numbers and what they meant, and then started using the formula, etc., in the question. So the logical setting out obviously leads to better marks, and this was a classic example of that. Rounding, be careful. So rounding, again, encourage students to do that once at the end. Rounding did affect this question greatly with that final answer. So again, rounding, watch that with students. And I think just training students to use that marking scheme, when it's 5 marks, they need to slow down and stop and think. That's a significant part of their paper. This one question is literally 5% of their marks. So they need to slow down a little bit, just read that question and use the marking guide. Some students try to do this in 2 lines. So for 5 marks, it's never going to be a 2-line response answer. Okay, so just make students aware that the more marks allocated, probably need to start showing a little bit more working out, a little bit more logic, a little bit more processes to gain those 5 marks. So the errors, obviously, that students were just distracted by things in this question. The reading, all right? So some students focused on the whole median regression line and tried to come up with all sorts of weird and wonderful graphs. Okay, that wasn't really the focus of this question. Significant number of students tried a solution that used gradient. So they tried using, rise over run in the middle of the question. That led to problems and led to it didn't then work logically with the rest of the question. They couldn't find a way to use that gradient somehow and incorporate it back into the question. So that's kind of usually where they stopped sort of down that correct path. So they didn't really need to go down a gradient path. But again, I think that's where the median regression line would have thrown some kids who would have been looking to find a gradient of that line, etc. Students who misread the question, so the X bar and the Y bar, they reversed them. So whatever value they should have had for X bar was their Y bar. Whatever value they should have had for Y bar was their X bar. So they had the right numbers, but allocated to the wrong things. Look, that was all in our marking scheme. We came up with so many different scenarios of substituted differently, come up with different answers. Please, rest assured, the marking schemes are very thorough. They looked at a lot, and any numbers in different ways from this question were still rewarded for their efforts and for their working out. So someone who reversed X bar and Y bar and did everything perfectly, but with things in the wrong order, they of course can't get full marks because they've done something wrong, but they're right up there. Okay, so they can definitely get 3s and 4s. So again, encourage engagement with this question or this type of longer question. It's 5 marks, they can't leave it blank. All right, so encourage engagement. Rounding I've talked about, yeah, that changed the final answer a lot. So again, rounding at the end. And a small number of students who didn't really engage with the question, but the one thing they might have picked out was X equals 19, which I think was right at the end of the question, and they substituted 19 into the formula for X. Look, that was a step. That was a step in the process. So again, they're still engaged. It's a very simple thing that they've engaged with, but again, our schemes are written so that students who engage in appropriate ways will be rewarded with marks. Okay, so again, if it's blank, it's very quick and simple to mark, but students will gain some marks that really they don't have to work too hard for. So you must encourage engagement with all questions. Ensure students, so learning outcomes, yep, encourage students to look at the marks allocated. So 5 marks for this question, that means there's 5 key things. So there should have been 5 key things in their response to this question. So working out, setting out. And I think we need as teachers to give our kids the opportunity to practice these longer questions, as I've said, and teach them how to focus in on those key components. So use a highlighter, use a red pen, write little hints in the margin to themselves or something as they're reading the question. Encourage them not to round early, I've said that. Encourage setting out in the logical order and write the solution in the space provided, not up amongst the question or the wording in the question. And I think that was about it for that question. Yeah. So that's it, guys. That's the end of my presentation. Hopefully, the main things to get out of that is just encourage kids to engage with all questions. It's amazing how many times a simple mark or 2 can be added to a student's total just because they've engaged, just because they've written 1 or 2 lines. They may not have got the full 5 or 4 or 3 or whatever marks, but they can still access the 1 or 2. So encourage that all the time. Encourage them to show their working, obviously. So all of these questions here, when you look at the solutions that are on the NESA site, they have all steps. There's working out there. So encourage them to set things out logically. And yeah. All right, so good luck with your teaching, and thanks.